Good afternoon. My name is David Holloway. I'm a former co-director of CSAC, and it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome today's speaker, Mariana Budjeryn, who is a senior research associate at managing the Atom project at the Belfer Center at the Kennedy School at Harvard, has been a visiting professor at Tufts and has been at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, and has published widely on nuclear issues and on Ukraine, but most recently and most importantly has published this book, Inheriting the Bomb, the collapse of the USSR and the nuclear disarmament of Ukraine. And she's going to speak today to the topics in that book with the added kind of words in the talk's title of Quiet Matters. Let me just say that I've read the book. It's wonderful. I give it my warmest recommendation for an exploration of matters which have, of course, strong resonance today, unfortunately, but to do with non-proliferation, nuclear weapons, and Ukraine. Mariana, it's a particular pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much, David. And I just want to acknowledge sort of your role in the fate of this book and in general in the scholarship. I met David, it was 2014, actually, at a conference in Switzerland. It was a small kind of nuclear history conference. And it was sort of my first big break into the up having a conversation with David over dinner without realizing he was the David Holloway. Sort of, I knew he was Professor David. And then only later did I look up and recognize I was talking to David Holloway, the author of Stalin and the Bomb. And since then, David has really been very supportive of this research and very encouraging. At times, where probably he didn't realize just how much it really mattered to have that kind of support and encouragement. So thank you so much. I will start with at the end. Why does it matter? That's an easy answer to the question. The Ukrainian nuclear history, in a way, came that about the ways Russia fights this war, but it's a survival of this country as an independent sovereign agency. It goes back the questions of why there is this security predicament and what could have been done to perhaps avoid this war, to prevent it, are front and center of debates. And also in Ukraine, I just spent 2 weeks there and I came back from the trip. And inevitably, the question of Ukraine's nuclear decision making back in the early 90s comes back. And especially the question of the famous, or for some people, infamous Budapest Memorandum that has gotten some of the, I feel, undeservedly bad reputation in Ukraine, where the public narrative converged on certainly a rather simplified position of, oh, Ukraine had the world's third largest nuclear arsenal and it gave it away for nothing because our leaders were stupid and because of the pressure of the powerful states. On the other extreme from that narrative is the rather surprising forgetfulness in the West that anything like that had happened, perhaps because Western institutional or US institutional memory is so short with the change of administrations, perhaps because there are other issues and this has happened a long time ago and has been largely forgotten. But even amongst the experts, I hear often and the kind of the stance, oh, for Ukraine, it was a non-choice. Those weren't Ukrainian weapons to give up anyways. Ukraine didn't have command and control. Ukraine didn't have, a lot of things. So it wasn't really a decision. It was, it was just something that happened to Ukraine. From my research, it seems that between those two polar positions, the truth or something that approximates truth, something, small t truth, is somewhere in the middle. And the story is more complicated than either one of these positions. So what I'd like to share with you is three main insights. I'm not going to certainly retell the story, which is well known in its general outlines, and its details are recorded in the books that I hope some of you will read. But some of the three insights or three takeaways that I think are relevant for today and that might be important for future research. But before I do that, there's a couple of maps that I put together to just to set this story up, because what happened in 1991 was really quite unprecedented. A major nuclear state, a nuclear superpower, a member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear weapons state under the NPT, disintegrated. It stopped existing as an agent in international affairs. And there was a short period in which sort of the succession to this entity was not exactly contested, but was being settled. And that Russia should, or the Russian Federation, one of the constitutive republics of the Soviet Union, should inherit most of the international legal statuses and most of the positions of the Soviet Union, was largely commonsensical and largely went uncontested. But the fate of inheritance, especially nuclear inheritance, in the other three constitutive Soviet republics, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, became a matter of some contestation. Amongst the three, Ukraine emerged as sort of the enfant terrible of the disarmament process. And its story is the most complicated and therefore the most interesting for historians and political scientists and people who are interested in nuclear nonproliferation. So you see, these are just strategic nuclear forces of the Soviet Union. They were kind of deployed in this big arc across the Eurasian landmass and included, missile silos and strategic bomber bases. And there were multiple warhead storages as well. And some of these things could be withdrawn quite quickly to, say, the Russian Federation, such as the tactical nuclear weapons. They were mobile. But things like silo-based missiles are not exactly that mobile. You can withdraw them quickly. They remained stationed in the non-Russian republics, and they were also covered by a number of arms control treaties. And the question of how to bring into force and implement those treaties under these new conditions became also a very much a pertinent question, which had to be negotiated and decided. This is the map, and I don't know how well you can see, but what Ukraine inherited, in addition to just missiles and bombers, was quite a robust infrastructure, military-industrial, a chunk of military-industrial complex of the Soviet Union. So when people said, oh, Ukraine didn't have command control, Ukraine didn't have full nuclear fuel cycle, that is certainly true. But Ukraine did have quite a robust capacity inherited, both scientific and military industrial, in in that sphere. One of the three major missile building facilities, missile design and building facilities in the entire Soviet Union, Yuzhny and Yuzhmash in Russian, Pivdenny in Ukrainian, was located in Dnipropetrovsk, now Dnipro. Kharkiv was a major center of military industry and nuclear science. There were at least a couple of research reactors. There was indigenous uranium mining and milling. Yes, there were very important parts that were missing. But when I find that today, certainly not to this audience, but today explaining this history involves also explaining that when the Soviet Union fell apart, it was the conflation, the perennial conflation of the Soviet Union and Russia creates a blind spot as to the periphery of the Soviet Union, where it seems that kind of the earth opened up, and out came the Kazakhs, and out came the Belarusians, and out came Ukrainians, and they were nomads, or they were toiling the land and engaging in agriculture and feeding Europe, and they didn't know what to do with these weapons, right? They were. And some of these narratives were purposefully perpetuated, certainly by Russia, of kind of imagery of a monkey with a grenade, some of the rather derogatory things. But that was certainly not true. There were very capable scientists, and there were missile specialists. Ukraine inherited what I like to call a very handsome proliferator starter package. So if Ukraine wanted to pursue this, it had some elements already in place. And so this is my first insight, that contra some of the arguments, Ukraine did have options, and it did have agency in the matter. As I said, it did inherit parts of the Soviet military-industrial complex. I just recently made acquaintance with a gentleman. He's Ukrainian. His daughter works at the Ukrainian service of Voice of America here in DC. And I discovered that he headed the archive department at the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, Minsredmash, which, as you well know, is a cryptic name for Ministry of All Things Nuclear. He had access to all of the archival material in that ministry. After the breakup of the Soviet Union, he moved to Ukraine, to Kyiv, in early 1992. But he said that his pass to the ministry still worked for another couple of years. You could come in and go through the. So when we talk about, Russians having a view into the workings of kind of Ukrainian politics and Ukrainian industry, we need to also acknowledge that Ukrainians too would have had a similar view into the Russian system, just because they all stemmed from a very integrated Soviet system, and ethnic Ukrainians did have clearances in the Soviet bomb project. Ukraine also eventually put forward this claim, and Steve Pfeiffer, you were talking about this earlier, about being a legitimate successor to the Soviet Union in all respects. And they tried to substantiate that claim also in the nuclear realm. Oftentimes, certainly in Russia and in the West, it was interpreted as perhaps a sign of Ukrainian nuclear ambitions. But what I tried to show in the book, that it was rather an attempt to reconstitute relationship with Russia on a more equal footing. So in a sense, to stake a claim that the Russia that's coming out of the Soviet collapse is as much a successor state to the Soviet Union as Ukraine is. The superstructure of the Soviet Union has gone away, and now there's a bunch of successors. And in the nuclear realm, it should be the four former republics that inherited these assets, these nuclear assets. What Ukrainian claim came up against was really the existence of the NPT. It became very difficult to legitimize that claim in a world where the Non-Proliferation Treaty existed. And that treaty recognized 5 five nuclear weapon states, and there wasn't room for more. It was almost like an org chart, right? It had 5 boxes, and when one box is kind of just fell apart, right, disintegrated, there could be only one, like in Highlander, it could be only one successor. So this was important. It became very important in this contestation about what and how to do with the nuclear weapons that were based in Ukraine. Ukraine's nuclear deliberations is one of the things that is important for us as social scientists. That I think somebody who's more geared toward political science wants to isolate really the drivers, right? The one factor, the one variable, right, that really determined what makes states kind of go for nuclear weapons or renounce them. At least in the Ukrainian case, the nature of nuclear decision making was to actually look at the broadest possible spectrum of costs and benefits of different kinds of consequences that this country could incur whichever path it should decide. There are 3 options that were considered, at least in the documents that I was able to find and consult. One was Ukraine as a non-nuclear weapon state and part of the NPT, joining the NPT, negotiating security guarantees, as Ukrainians call them, and compensation for the fissile material in these warheads. Another option was to do no such thing and retain these nuclear weapons and see, kind of develop them into a sort of nuclear deterrent, as it were, with considerable investment and by defying the international community. And the third option that seemed to have sort of the missile lobby, the Pivdeny lobby, and the actual missile officer corps behind it was to retain somehow ICBMs with a conventional warheads, sort of a precursor to prompt global strike, as it were. And in that option, interestingly, and I will talk about it a little bit later, what Ukrainians ran up against was not only the kind of global kind of nuclear order and the non-proliferation regime, but also the arms control architecture. Because when Ukrainians started looking at the ranges that would have been useful, even for this conventional deterrent, they found that those ranges were prohibited under the INF Treaty. And as one diplomat told me after a while, after there was all of this contestation, delay in ratifying the START Treaty, that these strategic forces were accounted under, he said, we all along, we were barking up the wrong treaty. It was the INF that really limited, should we, if Ukraine wanted to pursue that kind of option and adjust or, as it were, rework this nuclear inheritance into something that would have suited its strategic purposes, right? Because ICBMs that fly intercontinental ranges, 10, 15,000 kilometers, are useless as a deterrent if your adversary's capital is 500 kilometers or so away, right? Those are not the kinds of targets that you can hold at risk with those ranges. And so there were a number of things that weighed for each one of the options. In favor of nuclear retention, as it were, was the security situation that quickly deteriorated. Relations with Russia turned sour over Crimea, status of Crimea and Sevastopol, over the division of the Black Sea Fleet. The status concerns, as I mentioned, the recognition of a certain, at least formal equality of Ukraine as a successor to the Soviet Union on a par with Russia. There was also, a desire to keep American attention, US attention on Ukraine. Suddenly these countries that were non-entities, their capitals became the target of all these foreign delegations, all coming in and asking about nuclear weapons. These capitals would otherwise remain rather off the map of policymakers, And at least in the Ukrainian case, it seems that that singular attention initially on the nuclear issue, certainly under the Bush senior administration, kind of precipitated Ukrainian interest in these weapons. And so, they thought, well, if Americans really think they're so important, I suppose we should be thinking how important these weapons are for us. Um, and some of the people I talked to basically said, U.S. would not have let Yugoslavia descend into this chaos and bloodshed if that country had nuclear weapons. So, this was a way not, delaying the disarmament process was not only a way to kind of maybe deter or hedge against Russia, was also a way to keep Western attention glued to the Ukrainian security predicament. And then, as I mentioned, there were some vested domestic interests in trying to keep some kind of um, some kind of you know uh, defense option, right? Even if not non-nuclear, perhaps a conventional strategic option open. But there were also very salient factors weighing against nuclear weapons and against strategic armaments. And first and foremost, it was Chernobyl. It was the trauma, the lingering trauma of Chernobyl that in fact led Ukrainian parliament itself, before any engagement with U.S. or Russia on the issue, to include in its declaration of sovereignty in 1990, still well before the Soviet Union fell apart. No, well before, it was a year and a half, but when things were moving so quickly, that was a long time. Well before the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Ukrainians themselves declared that they wanted to be a non-nuclear state and a nuclear-free zone. Belarus said nuclear-free zone. Ukraine said non-nuclear-free state. And that Chernobyl was behind it was undoubtedly true. Of course, Ukraine was in throes of a major economic crisis. Any investment in a nuclear deterrent would have taken resources Ukraine did not have, or would have had to take away from really crucial areas. And it's not clear that Ukraine would have survived into sovereign adulthood if it decided to shift these resources towards an arms program. Certainly would not have gotten any sympathy in the West, nor would have gotten any stabilization funds from the IMF or the World Bank under those circumstances. But I think most importantly, one of the most important things in this discussion, the way I see it from sort of within the Ukrainian discourse, was the desire to join the international community on good terms. It was a fledgling state. It was emerging out of this, totalitarian empire, out of the evil empire, and it wanted to build itself into a kind of country that has this European future. Not a country that's isolated, not a country that's under sanctions, not a country that's a pariah. And so my argument is Ukraine disarmed or gave away its nuclear inheritance, not only because of the things it wanted to get in exchange, nor just because of the things it wanted to avoid, but because of the kind of country it wanted to become. There was a strong element of identity, at least in the part of the political, those political actors in Ukraine that engaged with the world, and they were part of defining this kind of identity for Ukrainians. So the second insight, and I have mentioned this before, is that Ukraine did not sort of enter a world that was a free-for-all, right? That world had structure and that world had order. And part of that global order was the international non-proliferation regime that was actually experiencing a high time, right? South Africa unilaterally disarmed and joined the NPT. After the Cold War, France and China were going to become formally part of the non-proliferation treaty as nuclear weapon state. There was expectation that Brazil and Argentina would join. There was the zeitgeist of of the world order was decidedly in favor of non-proliferation. That was before Pakistan and India kind of declared their nuclear deterrence. So for Ukraine, certainly would have been going, radically against the grain of that zeitgeist. Moreover, even the actors who were, opposed or more cautious towards this very quick disarmament and the accession to NPT, they had to grapple with what I call nuclear grammar, with the terms and categories provided by the NPT, by the non-proliferation regime, that presented them with two stark choices, right? There were nuclear weapon states and there were non-nuclear weapon states. There was two categories. There was nothing in between. There wasn't temporary nuclear state. There wasn't an owner of nuclear weapons as economic assets. There was none of that. They had to choose, and they could only choose to retain these weapons outside of the NPT, outside of that space, which, again, at that point was not attractive. And it raised questions, well, has it become a more acceptable space now, with India and Pakistan becoming increasingly accepted as, not pariah states, but sort of just states outside of the NPT, right, with nuclear deterrence. And I mentioned the arms control architecture. Much of the negotiations about the fate of this inheritance was transpired within the discourse of START, of the bringing START into force, of implementing the START treaty, and as I already mentioned, sort of the unsung role of the INF, right, in this story. Not to mention that before INF was adopted and implemented, Ukraine had many, many assets, INF range missiles deployed in its territory. So without INF, there have been mobile nuclear armed missiles, nuclear tipped missiles, that were a lot easier to grab and repurpose, as it were, than the big strategic missiles. But the point here is that the very existence of the international non-proliferation regime made sure that the nuclear part of inheritance fell under a different set of rules, a different set of terms than the conventional military inheritance, because nobody contested that Ukraine inherited tanks and aircraft and, artillery and all this other stuff, right? It became part of the CFE treaty, Conventional Force in Europe. It was, there were cuts proportional to whatever Ukraine inherited. And, it was something that was mostly negotiated outside of the international public attention, but not so with the nuclear part. And finally, this is looping back to the so-called Budapest Memorandum, the part of the deal, right? It wasn't all of the deal; it was part of the negotiated deal and set of conditions for Ukraine's disarmament that provided so-called security assurances to Ukraine. And in this room, we have two people who were directly involved in the negotiations of this document. But I think certainly on the Ukrainian side, there seems to have been a certain complacency that once that document was signed, that was, as you well know, translated as guarantees into Ukrainian, there was a tick on that box, and then there was somehow kind of this feeling of resting on laurels that we do have some security assurances, guarantees, or what have you. And in 2014, there was a brutal awakening to the fact that, well, the document itself, you read it, it's very succinct. It mostly restates assurances given in other multilateral documents, such as UN Charter or the Helsinki Final Act, as well as negative and positive nuclear-related, NPT-related security assurances. And that really, there is no automaticity, right? It's as there isn't actually, probably with Article 5, right? There's still a political process that's involved in it. And much of it, what the Budapest Memorandum could have been, and I would be very interested hear from Rose and Steve, it could have been a framework and it could have been a foundation for a very robust and continuous security collaboration between the two that for a number of reasons did not happen. So they, my allegation, as it were, is that Ukraine really neglected this document, neglected the opportunities that it provided before 2014. And unfortunately, after 2014, it seemed to be the West that didn't make enough of it. The document could have been leveraged, and even the defense assistance that was provided to Ukraine in the 8 years between 2014 and 2022 could have been couched, could have been framed as part of these commitments. And there would have been nothing extra. It would have just given the boost to the credibility of the non-proliferation regime more broadly. And the consequences certainly for the non-proliferation, the war is not over. It is still playing out. Certainly, there is damage to the credibility of the non-proliferation regime more broadly. The Budapest Memorandum is part and parcel of this broader regime. It's not part of the treaty, but the regime is much broader than just the text of the treaty. It's part of the history of this regime, and therefore its violation sends ripples across the whole system in less direct ways. There is, of course, the dimmer prospects of Article 6 fulfillment that is, already being targeted by many groups, including abolitionist groups and the TPNW crowd. And that will become more difficult to sustain within the NPT, or will sort of bring greater pressure onto the NPT. But also, it seems that the war broke out exactly in a space that was not covered by nuclear deterrence, right? It was not covered by deterrence of Ukraine's own nuclear, forces, nor by extended deterrence of an ally. And perhaps the conclusion is that, well, then deterrence works to contain this conflict, contain this war in Ukrainian territory. And we could expect a greater demand for US extended deterrence in the future, which will go counter to efforts to sort of wean the world of reliance on nuclear weapons. And again, putting stress on the non-proliferation regime. And so when I'm asked, was Ukraine right? Was that the right decision? Was that a wise decision to give up, quote unquote, give up nuclear weapons? I decided I was gonna answer it in one of two ways. One is to say, well, I just wrote a book about it. Why don't you read a book and make your own conclusion? And another way to answer it is that let's make sure that we act in such a way as to prove Ukraine right? It's still up to us. The consequences are still being decided. And I think as an international community, as a team, as a community of policymakers, we can still act in such a way as to prove Ukraine right in this decision making, and also set the right precedent for others. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mariana. Let me open it up now to questions. We normally take questions first from our fellows. And to those who are taking part by Zoom, if you could enter your questions on the Q&A, then we will come to those and try to cover as many questions as we can in the period that we have left. So, right, Naomi and...
Naomi Eagle, I'm a postdoc fellow here at Stanford. It's great to see you again, and thank you for a fantastic talk. I want to ask you a little bit more about Ukraine's desire to engage the world in the non-proliferation regime as a good member, and in particular about Ukraine's engagement with countries that aren't nuclear weapon states, that are the majority of states in the world, and to what extent Ukraine's Ukrainian officials and decision makers were concerned or reflected on the reactions of the non-nuclear weapon states. And I'm thinking also about the timing here of being right before the 1995 review conference and the indefinite extension. But I also wanted to ask you about Ukraine's engagement with the non-proliferation regime since 1994, that Ukraine is also, of course, not frozen in time in 1994, and sort of the engagement or the type of engagement that Ukraine has had since 1994 with the non-proliferation regime.
Thank you so much. Actually, two really, really good questions. So to the first one about the reaction, I assume it's, one when there were doubts whether Ukraine would disarm or what it would decide to do. There's a very interesting episode that's actually described in the book that served as a kind of litmus test for what that reaction was or what the positions were. And that was the conditional ratification by the Ukrainian parliament of the START Treaty in November 1993. So the Ukrainian parliament decided it was going to ratify START, but in a very qualified way that interpreted. Yeah, I see it's triggering some painful. That interpreted Ukraine's obligation under the treaty not as complete disarmament, but as reductions, because it's an arms limitations and reductions treaty, right? So they calculated the percentages for delivery vehicles and warheads that Ukraine was, and then said, yes, we're committed to disarm further, but that would take further, negotiations and, further treaties. And there was an international uproar, or there was a diplomatic uproar, I should say. And the documents of the Ukrainian foreign ministry that was generally very well disposed towards disarmament. It was one of the big proponents of kind of the accession to the NPT. They were bracing for it. They knew it was coming. They knew this diplomatic storm was coming, and they tried to crisis manage. And there are reports from different embassies that were coming in about kind of taking the temperature of the different reactions. And what came out through these reports that no Ukrainian neighbors such as Poland or Hungary or Austria, even Turkey, they were not worried about that at all. There wasn't sort of the domino theory in the making. In fact, the Turks said, well, we totally understand why you guys are taking this stance. I mean, Russia is being difficult in Crimea, and you have security challenges, and we sort of understand this. The countries that took it the hardest were the nuclear weapon states, were the United States and Russia. And the rest really didn't care that much. And the 1995 NPT RevCon was an extension conference, was a very important milestone. Again, it was very important for the United States, and in particular, Tom Graham Jr., who had the task of going around the world and convincing everyone to join it. And it was important to get Ukraine's accession to the NPT before the extension conference. And I think that was part of the kind of the urgency and the pressure in Ukraine. In terms of post-94, I think Ukraine could have done a much better job about being active within the non-proliferation regime. Kazakhstan became a really, they really kind of scored the international brownie points and really used their credentials to both contribute to the non-proliferation regime and also get the kind of status as a country that contributed to it, promoted through disarmament. Ukraine, unfortunately, didn't, and I don't know, I don't have a good answer for why. It didn't do so, not nearly enough. And I think partly, certainly since the early 2000s, was because they had NATO ambitions when NATO is a nuclear alliance. So they could not, they try to go very carefully with being too anti-nuclear in order not to undermine their chances for perhaps eventual NATO membership.
Luis.
Hello, my name is Luis Rodriguez. I'm a fellow here at CSAC. Thanks a lot for the presentation. My question comes out of curiosity. I've been going to all of these different nuclear conferences, and I see deterrence and disarmament proponents taking very different lessons from what is happening in Ukraine and for what they hope Ukraine would teach us as lessons. With deterrence people telling us that, well, this basically teaches us that if a country wouldn't have given up or would develop a weapon, this wouldn't have happened, and thus they expect Ukraine to potentially try to either develop, get a nuclear weapon, get under the nuclear umbrella, get into NATO, all of this stuff. Disarmament folks, on the other hand, expect that with this, we will try to get Russia and all the nuclear powers eventually to get rid of their nuclear weapons. With Beatrice Fenn during the summer even saying that she hopes that Ukrainians will start pointing the finger at Russia saying, give up your nuclear weapons. But no one actually asked what Ukrainians are thinking. So I wonder if you have any insights into where in this spectrum or dichotomy Ukrainians fall into.
The short answer is no. I don't know where Ukrainians are in this. And I do share your impression about sort of the increased polarization of the lessons drawn from Ukraine. In some important way, both are valid, right? And both underline the kind of the tensions within the system, right? The global nuclear order where there are countries that rely on deterrence, and that for those deterrence does work. It's part of their security posture, security policy. And then there is kind of the disarmament, the non-proliferation disarmament, kind of abolitionist movement that shows to this and says, see, this is what happens. The country can use their nuclear deterrent or their nuclear weapons as a shield for kind of an enabler, as it were, for a conventional campaign and go, why is Ukraine not invoking Article 51 of the United Nations Charter for collective defense? Because nobody would come, it would be embarrassing. I don't know what the Ukrainians are thinking about it, other than, in the lead up right now, of course, much attention is focused on the conventional armaments and the conventional campaign. Having just come out of, just sort of returned from a trip to Ukraine, I was surprised about how little discussion there is of a potential use by Russia of nuclear weapons. At least Ukrainians are not deterred in the way they conduct their conventional campaign by the consideration of a possible Russian nuclear strike. They're mostly constrained by whatever weapons and capabilities, conventional weapons and capabilities they have. The Ukrainians. I think there was sort of this somewhat unhelpful narrative in the lead up to the war by Ukrainians. Several Ukrainian officials were like, well, if we don't have guarantees and we don't have NATO memberships, we will, Zelensky said it at the Munich security conference, will review the whole package of decisions connected with the Budapest Memorandum, allegedly maybe the membership in NPT. That had only backfired, right? That only provided fuel for the Russians saying, see, they have nuclear ambitions and therefore we must invade, and their biolabs and dirty bombs and all of that. So I think there's very little understanding. Again, and I said the U.S. has short institutional memory, but probably Ukraine as well. I find that there isn't, kind of a deep understanding what exactly has gone down. The issue is controversial. Some of the people who were, Rose's and Steve's interlocutors back in the day, including then Deputy Minister Boris Tarasuk, have come under great fire and have stayed quiet. President Kravchuk, who signed the Budapest Memorandum, has stayed very quiet, declining many comments on that process. So instead of educating the public as to perhaps, complexities and the difficulty of this decision, they've decided to stay out of it. And part of the hope for my book is that maybe if it does get translated into Ukrainian, might help to explain that actually I think Ukrainian leaders back in the day did a really good job under the circumstances with very limited resources, very little leverage. They at least got this Budapest Memorandum signed, because the choice was not between getting Budapest security assurances and Article 5 kind of guarantee. The choice was between that and nothing. And so we got to give them credit. So answer.
Ori.
Thank you, Mariana, for this great talk and what I think is a groundbreaking book. I think its importance will only grow in the coming.
I won't repeat that, but I'll just say that I think it's a groundbreaking book and you're doing a fantastic job. So I wanted to know, you mentioned the three options and the discussion, the different narratives inside the Ukraine. And we talked a little bit about those who won the deal, the norms and the ideas they had when they wanted to join the NPT. Could you tell us a little bit more about the other camp? Who was in the opposite camp? The former military, current military, missileers, who was in the camp? What was their ideal type? What were their norms? What were they envisioning and thinking? It's just very, very interesting. It's the road not taken, etc. And how realistic was that narrative dream path that they were pursuing? You mentioned that maintaining the nuclear infrastructure outside the NPT would have required investment. And I want to know what kind of investment, how realistic was it? Because from what I've heard, people mention that it was completely unrealistic. It would have tanked the economy. I'd like to hear more about that, because I think we're buying maybe too much into the idea that only superpowers can afford nuclear weapons. I come from a background which says, no, actually smaller countries can do that too. So I would really like to hear that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So as I mentioned, the foreign ministry and generally the executive, the president's office at the time were generally in favor of the NPT route. Now, there was a faction, a more nationalistically kind of oriented faction in the parliament that thought that was kind of this rapid charge towards the NPT was misguided. It was defeatist, that at the very least, Ukraine had to negotiate a deal, right? And delay this process. So they played for delaying tactics. These people were mostly, and that was the sort of the so-called national Democrats in the Ukrainian parliament and the Rada. Many of them were literati. They came out from, the Ukrainian Writers Union. They were the dissidents in the Soviet period. They were instrumental in kind of pushing Ukraine towards independence. But many of them had absolutely no clue what nuclear weapons were and how to, what they do. I was told that one of them on a trip to one of the bases was asking how a missile silo, how they calculate the tilting of the missile silo when it's launched to the United States so it goes on the right trajectory. So that's kind of was the level of understanding. Now I have to, I mean, it's kind of logical, right? But it's not to make it, not to discount them. There was a very steep learning curve for everyone in Ukraine, outside of perhaps the military itself. And a lot of people caught up very quickly. And then when sort of the defense and military establishment was kind of solidified already, there was kind of a center for strategic, I think, analysis or something like that that conducted feasibility studies. There was a National Institute for, the National Space Institute, I think, was headed by Hurbulin. There were, here's the thing, there was a feasibility study for centrifuge design. And this is in the third slide, sorry, it's a little blurred, was all the Ukrainian-based companies that could produce parts for a centrifuge facility. So you wouldn't really have to go outside for procuring those. This is 1994, September 1994. So there, and of course, Ukraine has a very robust civilian nuclear industry, which, certainly uranium enrichment for that purpose would have made sense, at least as an argument for it. And there was a huge amount of spent fuel, especially from Chernobyl, which was the RBMK reactor that produced the kind of fuel that would have lended itself for plutonium reprocessing. And as you say, nuclear technologies, they're technologies of 1940s, right? There's nothing particularly, if Pakistan, North Korea, and Israel could have developed a nuclear weapon, certainly with certain effort and investment, so could Ukraine. What Ukraine didn't have was, the benefit of secrecy. That process was absolutely transparent because of the sort of circumstances under which it happened. It was right away in the public view. And it was also transparent to, of course, the Russians who, had Ukraine penetrated very, very well at the time. Now, there's kind of an argument or, whether Russians would have invaded or not had Ukraine, launched a program in the early 90s, probably not, but they would have had other ways to sabotage the program probably and penetrated very, very much. So that remains a difficult counterfactual, right? But I think you're absolutely right and that's one of the things that I'm trying to communicate in the first insight, is that there were options. If there were a political will at that time, there were, they could have delayed it, and who knows, maybe even, they would have survived the isolation and would become not like North Korea, but more like India, Pakistan. I mean, we don't, we still engage with those two countries, but it is for certain that Ukraine would have been a different country than it is now. It wouldn't have been the same country plus nuclear weapons. What kind is, for us, as we know, for historians, it's hard to account for all the little things that would have changed and combined.
Steve.
Mariana, thank you very much. I finished your book yesterday. I learned a lot. And one question, because I learned something, but I want to push on it a little bit, was in the fall of 1993, Jim Timby, who I think is not here, and I had a conversation with somebody within the Ukraine Foreign Ministry about actual control of the nuclear weapons. And we thought that the Russians were still involved, particularly with the custody of weapons that were removed from the air-launched cruise missiles and the spare warheads that were basically in a storage site. Our assumption being that the Russians sort of had inner security and the Ukrainians had outer security, sort of a case of mirror imaging. We were told in no uncertain terms by our Ukrainian interlocutors, the foreign ministry, what are you talking about? As of the spring of 1992, the only Russian military personnel in Ukraine are the Black Sea Fleet. The Black Sea Fleet has nothing to do with the strategic nuclear weapons, at which point we said that means that those weapons in custody are solely under Ukrainian custody. And later, including at that conference we were at 3 or 4 years ago in Italy, I had former Russian military officers say, yes, they were just Ukrainian personnel there. However, your book at a couple times, it talks about, for example, the guys sitting in the silos, the missileers, that in fact, some of them had not yet taken the oath to Ukraine until as late as 1994. And I think you also, there was sort of an implication in the book, at some points there in fact were Russians involved with the warheads on Ukrainian territory. So I wonder if you could explain that. And is this a case that maybe the Ukrainian military was doing some things with the Russians that perhaps the civilian side was not fully aware of?
That's a very good question. It's very difficult to kind of unpack that. And I don't think I did, a great job in the book with sorting out exactly what and where happened, because I also got conflicting accounts. My understanding is that certainly the Air Force was the first, or the Strategic Air Force was the first to take Ukrainian oath early in 1992. And which prompted Russia to mount a special operation to disable the cruise missiles, to disable the targeting tapes on the cruise missiles, kind of rendering them useless or inoperable in that sense. In the strategic nuclear forces, the decision, strategic rocket forces, the decision was not to administer the Ukrainian oath to the actual missileers and the command of the army and the divisions, but also not administer the CIS oath. So they remained under the old Soviet oath, but in the operational sort of configuration of that was very confusing, because the daily drills, because these forces, they lived a daily military life of drills and doing practice things that they do in the command silos. Those were still channeled from Moscow through the regular kind of channels. And yet, kind of their salaries were paid by Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, right? So it was, in short, my impression that it was quite messy. And therefore, Ukrainian Ukrainian Defense Ministry, in particular, Minister Konstantin Morozov, Ukraine's first defense minister, was actually quite in favor of disarmament, of getting rid of these strategic missile forces, because they were sort of this enmeshed, still linkage to Moscow, and he was afraid that at any point those could be used by Russia as kind of a way to either sabotage or do something, unless there's a full control, as it were, a full line of command that's established there. The actual senior command of the Vinnytsia army, the 43rd Army, took Ukrainian oath, was actually, asked in no uncertain terms to take Ukrainian oath in the spring of 1994. And one of the division, the one that was in Khmelnytsky, the division commander refused and was moved to Russia, and a new commander was appointed. So the actual custody, I think, in the central storages remained under the 12th Gumo throughout the time. But there were also storage facilities for the spares on the side of the division, in the division sort of territory of the Pervomaisk 46th division. So they had those because they had 3 or so sets of spares for the spare kind of the head part, was the boyevoy komplekt, for each of the missiles. So the missiles were armed, right, in the silos, plus 3 spares, and those were fully under Ukrainian, and in on the sort of Ukrainian military authority. So it seemed that there were still kind of counter crossing lines of command and control that were not a good situation in this circumstance.
We're very close to the time to end, but I want to at least allow 2 questions to be put. I'm sorry, I'm reading the clock creatively here. One from one of our Zoom listeners, Mary Steiner, who asks whether Ukraine declaring itself to be neutral like Switzerland would have been the viable step. And you mentioned in the book a discussion of Austria as a model. So that's one question. And Rose, you had a question too. And
yeah, thank you. This was a wonderful presentation, and I've been aware of your research all the years you were writing the book, so you did a really thorough job. It's fantastic. But I was much struck by your remark that Ukraine did not leverage the Budapest document sufficiently prior to 2014, and the US and UK sidelined it. I wouldn't say after 2014. I think it was more of a symbiotic kind of, Ukraine wasn't paying much attention to it, and then, I'm not blaming Ukraine. I'm just saying there was a symbiotic relationship going on. But my question is, do you think on the Ukrainian side, this might have had something to do with the fact that they were so effective, actually, in my view, in negotiating the deals to get their national borders recognized and so forth and so on in the context of the basing agreement for the Black Sea Fleet. That's that package of documents that was reached in 1997, which were legally binding. As far as I know, they still are legally binding. To my mind, they might have taken precedence in the Ukrainian government thinking on this matter. So that's a question.
Thank you. So first one about neutrality in Switzerland. At the time of the signing of the Budapest Memorandum and the discussions, Ukraine was declared as a nuclear state, and that was the policy it wanted for itself. The whole NATO and Western kind of ambitions of NATO membership, those did not arise until later. The idea was at the time, and David reminded that one of the examples or the precedents that was floated around the time was the Austria State Agreement, or State Treaty, I should say, of 1955, as a legally binding document, but legally sort of fixing this neutrality as to no one side should move onto the Ukraine, onto sort of challenge Ukrainian borders and sovereignty, or under these conditions, Ukraine would remain neutral. The question becomes, well, even if that were breached, what would have been a Russian, Western reaction and to the breach of that treaty? That would have had to involve pledging some consequences, right? And again, those consequences for the breach of this neutrality, I'm having a hard time believing that U.S. would have actually undertaken any more robust pledges than whatever was recorded in the memorandum already. But there's to say that there could have been other formats, perhaps, that could have been pursued. Rose, you're correct in noting that there was a treaty of friendship between Russia and Ukraine that was signed, that was ratified by both parliaments. It was legally binding, recognizing the borders. There was even a previous 1990, I think, agreement between the Ukraine and Russia still as Soviet republics, kind of recognizing each other's borders. I'm not sure. Of course, Ukraine had its own very turbulent internal history with some of the administrations being more favorable towards cooperating with Russia. And so Yanukovych extended the lease for a very long time on the Black Sea Fleet. But I don't know if it was a comfort that Ukrainians took in the legally binding nature so much of that treaty, as the Ukrainians were told, and rightly concluded themselves, that it's the economic development of that country that really should be the focus and the best sort of guarantee, as it were, of its security, to be kind of a prosperous state. Even as late as early February last year, I mean, Zelensky was trying to dismiss, or whatever, not to so panic with his dismissal of the invasion, with the idea that you got to save the economy somehow. So these patterns of thinking were continuing into so late, even when it was very clear that a conventional hard security threats were upon us. So I think that was probably the case. That's my impression, but I don't know for sure. It's always that security is always too much until it is not enough, right? It's very hard to say, oh, we should have built these arms, or we should have invested in these weapon systems, instead of now going around with a stretch out hand begging for tanks, because even 5 years ago, it would have been difficult to substantiate these investments in defense. Now we know better in retrospect. Thank you.
Mariana, thank you for a wonderful talk and Q&A session.